Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. And we're so pleased to have you join us today for the YIVO Library in New York, Personal Reflections on its History and Collections. We're really pleased to have Zachary Baker joining us for this talk. Zachary Baker was the head librarian of YIVO, so he's very particularly suited to be giving this talk. And this talk is actually the first of many programs we're going to be doing during 2025 to celebrate YIVO's 100th anniversary. It's kind of incredible. YIVO was founded 100 years ago in 1925. So this year is a big celebratory year for us. And we're going to be doing programs exploring all sorts of aspects of YIVO's history. This program is a very special one because the library, along with our archives, is really the core of the institution. Making the materials we have in our collections available to researchers around the world is the very center of what we do. In addition to public programs like this, classes and exhibitions which bring to life the world of those collections. So we're really pleased to start off our centennial celebrations with this talk. In our centennial programming, we have weekly treasures from the archives and library, videos which are coming out on YouTube as well as our social media platforms. And we have talks on the YIVO art section, on the sound archive, on Lucy Davidovich and the Aspirantor program, on new trends in YIVO scholarship. And this spring culminates in a conference about YIVO in America, charting the path. Since 1940, YIVO has been headquartered here in New York, and telling the story of how YIVO has changed and evolved during that time. And that a conference in late June is going to coincide with the opening of an exhibition called Hail to the Zomlers, YIVO's Collection at 100. And so it's, really pleased to have all of you here with us to start off this centennial celebration. And like I said, Zachary Baker couldn't be better suited to talk about our library today. Zachary M. Baker is the Reinhard Family Curator Emeritus of Judaica and Hebraica collections in the Stanford University Libraries, where he also served as Assistant University Librarian for Collection Development. Previously, he was the head librarian of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. He has published extensively in the fields of Yiddish studies and Judaica bibliography, and is a member of the core team of the Digital Yiddish Theater Project. Zachary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Julia. And I'd like to thank our hosts at YIVO, Jonathan Brent, and other friends and staff members for offering me this opportunity to speak about the history of YIVO's library. I'll be sharing a slide presentation. In fact, I'll switch to the share screen before I go any further, and hopefully this will work, and that you see that. So I'll be reading from a text here rather than speaking spontaneously, though I'll occasionally probably interject a comment or two. So in my talk, I'll discuss the library's collections, some of its notable librarians, and its contributions to scholarship and librarianship. Though my main focus is on YIVO in New York, where it's been based since 1940, I'll also touch upon the legacy of the Vilna YIVO. I'll have relatively little to say concerning the YIVO library's history during the 21st century. Since 2000, I've been an observer from afar and only an occasional visitor to YIVO in its present quarters at the Center for Jewish History. So anything I might say about what's gone on in the past 25 years at YIVO there might be some inaccuracies or out-of-date reflections there. So the YIVO Library, it's one of the world's foremost libraries of intrinsically Jewish content, what we call Judaica, and of works in the Hebrew alphabet regardless of content, or Hebraica. The library's holdings are particularly strong in their documentation of Jewish history, culture, and religion in Eastern Europe, the immigration of Eastern European Jews to the United States, anti-Semitism, and the Nazi Holocaust. As we'll hear, the YIVO Library is a collection of collections, now comprising an estimated 400,000 or so volumes. How did it all begin? When YIVO's organizing committee met in Berlin in August of 1945, as Dina Abramowicz has written, it was decided to create a bibliographic center which would be a depository and registration point for the Jewish book and newspaper production, and would also collect pertinent publications in other languages. The library was originally planned as an adjunct to the Bibliographic Center. Subsequent developments, however, led to a rapid expansion of the YIVO Library's coverage. The Bibliographische Zentrale relied extensively upon YIVO's network of Sammlers for the acquisition of these publications, which were destined ultimately for its library. In 1933, YIVO's library and archival collections were moved to a specially constructed building in Vilna at Vivolskiego 18. By 1938, the YIVO Library's holdings were estimated at 10,000 book volumes and 40,000 book volumes and 10,000 volumes of periodicals. I am going to have to exit here because I am showing the wrong slide presentation. So hold on a second and I will look for the correct one. I have a short version and a long version, and what you were seeing was the long version. So hold on briefly while I find my shorter version. I'm going to have to go into my PowerPoint applications and dig up the hold on one second. Very good. Okay. I'm getting there. And let me find the screen. Whoops. Almost there. So do you see the slide presentation?
Yes, just you can go into presenter mode.
Okay, will do. So pardon me for that little glitch. What you saw in the previous slide, in the previous iteration of that slide, excluded what you see on the right side of the screen, which is what I intended to show. So as the historian David Fishman has written, from 1941 to 43, YIVO's building on Vivolskiego 18 in Vilna was commandeered by the task force led by the Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg. At that location, 20 Jewish forced laborers, the Paper Brigade, sorted through materials that the occupiers had confiscated from Jewish and non-Jewish libraries and archives. The Nazis shipped vast quantities of books, periodicals, and archival documents from Vilna to Germany. The Jewish materials were intended for an anti-Semitic research institute in Frankfurt am Main. Members of the Paper Brigade courageously smuggled hundreds of valuable books, periodicals, and documents back into the Vilna ghetto, where they were hidden. After the war, some of these materials, together with much contemporary documentation of Jewish life in the ghetto, were uncovered by the writers Abraham Sutzkever and Shmerke Kaczerginski, and in a second clandestine operation were sent to YIVO's reconstituted headquarters in New York City. This is after World War II. However, the Sutzkever-Kaczerginski collection comprises but a small fraction of the library and archival materials from Vilna that YIVO in New York eventually received after World War II. The American section of YIVO, the Am Optel, had been formed in 1925, the same year that YIVO itself was established. The Am Optel's supporters sent funds from the United States to YIVO in Vilna, as well as books, newspapers, and archives, and it also produced its own research publications. For most of its existence, the Am Optel did not maintain a library or archive of its own. In 1935, a group of New York-based Yiddish cultural activists established the Central Jewish Library and Archives, which was led by individuals who were likewise prominent members of the Am Optel. They included the literary critic Shmuel Charny, who wrote under the pen name Shin Niger, the historian Jacob Shatsky, the journalist and bibliographer Moshe Starkman, and the folklorist Yud Lamed Khan. The Central Jewish Library opened its doors on October 22, 1938, and was housed in the Hayas building on Lafayette Street, where YIVO's Am Optel also kept its office. You might recognize that building if you're a New Yorker on the right-hand part of that slide. In late 1939, the Central Jewish Library was officially incorporated into the Am Optel. The following year, after the outbreak of the war and the arrival in New York of the linguist Max Weinreich, the Central Jewish Library became YIVO's official library. Mendel Elkin. He was a Zelig-like figure in modern Yiddish culture. He was born in 1874 near the city of Bobroisk in present-day Belarus. Before becoming a librarian, Elkin was, as the Yiddish linguist Yudel Mark once put it, and I'm quoting, a dentist who became a specialist in his profession and wrote articles about dentistry, a forestry expert starting out as a hired hand who earned barely enough for porridge with water, kein Wasser auf Kasche, and then became a wealthy merchant, a librarian for a colossal library and an accomplished fundraiser, a writer of prose, drama, and even poetry, an editor, a newspaper man, and a translator, an ethnographer who artistically depicted the steppes of Koibal, a woodcarver, a sketcher, and a collector of objets d'art. And on top of all that, an actor, a director, a builder of theaters, a playwright, a translator for the stage, an instructor in a theatrical studio, an editor of a theater journal. So you see the famous group photograph of the avant-garde Chaliastra literati, which was taken in Warsaw in 1922, a year before Elkin departed for the US. He's the figure seated off to the left, flanking Peretz Hirschbein, Uri Tzvi Greenberg, Peretz Markish, Melich Ravitch, and Yud Zinger. In unpublished jottings in the YIVO archives, Elkin listed among his literary acquaintances the following: Mendel Elkin, Yud Lamed Peretz, Sholem Aleichem, Shin Ansky, David Bergelson, Sholem Ash, Peretz Hirschbein, Chaim Nachman Bialik, and Shaul Chernichovsky. In a nutshell, which of the famous Yiddish and also Hebrew writers of his era did Mendel Elkin not know, and who of these did not know Elkin? And in 1938, Elkin became the librarian of the Central Jewish Library, and he subsequently served as YIVO's chief librarian until his death in 1962. Mendel Elkin stood at the forefront of the YIVO Library's intensive acquisition efforts, and he was also active in fundraising on YIVO's behalf. There was no budget to buy books, so Elkin became a Sammler on a grand scale. As Dina Abramowicz later remarked, in subsequent better years, he enjoyed telling how he crawled through attics and cellars and gathered the orphaned and homeless Yiddish books. Mendel traveled across the country, and in every city that he visited, he would mobilize his many acquaintances and friends for this purpose. Under Elkin's guidance, the YIVO Library became a collection of collections, the library that we know today. The roster of outstanding private collections that Elkin brought to YIVO includes those of the Chicago Yiddish publishers and book lovers Moshe and Bina Tseshinsky, the Yiddish literary scholar Kalman Marmor, the political philosopher Chaim Jitlovsky, and the Yiddish critic Shin Niger. The library kept each of the individual collections together by shelving their volumes according to accession number rather than shelf classification. In effect, the library stacks organization was an archival rather than, let's say, a Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress type of arrangement on the shelves. In the absence of a Yiddish national library, Elkin staked the claim that YIVO should serve that purpose, and he impressed the principle of legal deposit upon his friends in the Yiddish literary world, meaning they should donate the books that they were writing and publishing to YIVO rather than have YIVO go out and buy them somewhere. In 1944, the New York YIVO relocated from its former quarters on Lafayette Street to a townhouse at 535 West 123rd Street, adjacent to the Jewish Theological Seminary and near Columbia University. It would remain there until 1955. As a research institute devoted to Eastern European Jewish history and culture, YIVO's wartime fate mirrored that of the community to which it once belonged. Right after World War II, YIVO acquired important archival and library collections relating to the Holocaust. One of them is the so-called Nazi collection, comprising about 6,100 book and periodical volumes, reflecting Nazi perspectives on Germany's position in the world and pseudo-scholarship on the so-called Jewish question. Max Weinreich relied extensively on that collection while working on his impassioned book, Hitler's Professors, published by YIVO in both Yiddish and English in 1946. Almost 1,300 books and pamphlets and at least 300 journal and newspaper runs from the YIVO Library's Nazi collection are included in microfilm sets that were produced in the first decade of the 2000s. Meanwhile, the archival and library materials that the Nazis had shipped from all over Europe to Frankfurt were discovered by American forces in Germany in the summer of 1945. Hundreds of thousands of volumes that had been looted from Judaica collections across Europe were moved to a central storage depot in Offenbach. Lucy Schildkret, also later known as Lucy Davidovich, an American scholar who spent a year in the Vilna YIVO's aspirantur program before the war, visited the Offenbach depot, where she identified tens of thousands of books and periodicals belonging to the Vilna YIVO, along with extensive portions of the Vilna YIVO's pre-war archives. This set the stage for the most dramatic phase in YIVO's collecting activities, the recovery of its Vilna archives and library, along with thousands of volumes from the Strashun library of the Vilna Kehila. Ultimately, in the summer of 1947, 400 crates, you see them here in this photo, containing archives, books, and periodicals were shipped from Germany to YIVO, forming what is now known as the Vilna collection. When the treasure trove of YIVO's books from Vilna miraculously came to YIVO in New York, wrote the poet and critic Melech Ravitch, Elkin unpacked all 30,000 volumes from the boxes and placed them on the shelves, which he and his brother had constructed with their own hands. The library portion of the Vilna collection falls into four principal categories: press materials, estimated at about 3,000 volumes, rabbinica, 25,000 volumes, secular Hebrew books, 8,000 volumes, and secular Yiddish books, 5,000 volumes. In addition, the Vilna collection contains a few hundred volumes in European languages. While periodicals in the Vilna collection originally were part of the YIVO press archives, most of the books had belonged to other Vilna libraries, primarily the Strashun library. The Chabad Rebbe's librarian in New York, Reb Chaim Lieberman, cataloged the rabbinic works in the Vilna collection during the 1950s and 1960s. No less important, in my opinion, are the YIVO Library's extensive holdings of books and periodicals published after World War II in the Jewish displaced persons camps of Germany, Austria, and Italy. These were acquired through YIVO's network of Sammlers in the DP camps, as well as from Jewish overseas relief agencies and connections with Jewish organizations in Poland. These collections provide an invaluable source of reminiscences, eyewitness accounts, and early scholarly studies of the Nazis' genocidal war against the Jews. In 1954, YIVO and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem mounted a joint project aimed at producing archival inventories, scholarly guides, and bibliographies on the Holocaust. The joint bibliographical series, more than a dozen book-length bibliographies were published. That series relied extensively on the YIVO Library's holdings of the DP Press. In the 1960s, the YIVO Library microfilmed its collection of the DP Press as part of a large-scale project sponsored by the Ab Khan Fund, named after the late editor of the Yiddish Forwards. In 1990, YIVO, in cooperation with University Publications of America, made this microfilm collection more widely available to libraries. Over the course of decades, as I've mentioned, the YIVO Library acquired many sizable private libraries belonging to prominent Yiddish cultural figures. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention the small but significant collection of Ladino books donated by William Milwitsky, who by profession was a foreign language teacher and dialect coach. And what you see on the left there is a Singer sewing machine manual in Ladino. And on the right, an issue of the journal, I'll mention it shortly, Judaica Librarianship, in which the Library of Congress's practices on the transcription, romanization, we call it in library jargon, of Ladino was discussed. In 1955, YIVO relocated to a prime property facing Central Park on Fifth Avenue, a few short blocks north of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. On a typical summer day, in the YIVO Library's reading room, the windows are wide open and readers in various levels of formal and informal attire are seated at the tables. The man in the plaid short-sleeved shirt at the right is the Yiddish linguist Mordechai Schechter. The one woman in the photo standing toward the rear is Dina Abramowicz, who succeeded Mendel Elkin as head librarian in 1962. Dina was the public face of the library, while Elkin's desk, while he was still head librarian, was located in an inner sanctum inside the third floor book stacks. Among his frequent visitors there was the playwright Osip Dimov, who never failed to bring him his latest death mask, wrote Dina Abramowicz in an obituary for Elkin. A small photo graced Elkin's office as a reminder of his salad days. It was a group portrait of the writers Yud Lamed Peretz and Yankiv Dinason, the publisher Boris Kletskin, and Mendel Elkin. If Elkin was remembered at YIVO for his assiduous collection building efforts and for his carpentry skills, Dina gathered fame for her expertise as a reference librarian. She was born in Vilna in 1909 and had a trilingual upbringing. Both of her parents were educators. Her father, Hirsch Abramowicz, was the director of the Hilf durch Arbeit Technical School in Vilna. The home language was Russian, and she was educated in Yiddish and Polish. Dina was a graduate of Stefan Batory University in Vilna, as it was called between the wars, and where she received a master's degree in philosophy and Polish literature. From 1939 until the Nazi occupation in 1941, she worked in the Jewish Central Children's Library of Vilna. When the war broke out in September 1939, Hirsch Abramowicz was visiting his brother in the United States. He remained in the US and afterwards was reunited with his daughter, Dina. During the Nazi occupation of Vilna, she worked in the Vilna Ghetto Library under the supervision of Hermann Kruk, whose ghetto diary was later published in Yiddish by YIVO and in an English translation by the Yale University Press. The Ghetto Library occupied the premises of the former Mefitze Haskola Library, whose multilingual collections were geared to the popular reading habits of the Jewish public that it once served. And you see that in the background on the left. Dina survived the Vilna Ghetto and escaped to a partisan unit where she remained until liberation in 1944. Dina Abramowicz was a librarian at YIVO for over 60 years. When Mendel Elkin died in 1962, she was promoted to head librarian, a position that she held for another quarter century. Her bibliographical expertise was unmatched. As the historian Samuel Kassaw once put it, she has the whole library in her head. Throughout her years at YIVO, Dina's assistance was acknowledged by many of the researchers whom she helped. One of these was the literary critic and historian Irving Howe, who showered praises on YIVO's indefatigable and splendid librarian, Dina Abramowicz, in the acknowledgments to his classic book, The World of Our Fathers. Dina Abramowicz passed away in April 2000, 1 month shy of her 91st birthday. An entire generation was missing from the ranks of staff and clientele at YIVO when I first worked there during the late 1970s. The graduate students and a goodly number of employees were in their 20s and early 30s, and almost everyone else, board of directors, administrators, research scholars, custodians, researchers, they were in their 60s and up. There was a cultural chasm between the American-born youth and our European-born elders. In those years, the library's readers fell into several categories, including Yiddish writers and scholars, YIVO's in-house scholars, the Max Weinreich Center's faculty and students, YIVO staff who were working on special projects, curiosity seekers from the neighborhood, and actors and directors, and finally, a growing horde of genealogists. The library's reading room, which you can see here, was in a palatial hall on the second floor of that once grand townhouse. Readers sat at wooden tables in the middle of the room, while the staff worked at desks along the periphery. In one corner, Leivik's tree stood. This was a potted palm that had been bequeathed to YIVO by the Yiddish poet Hey Leivik. Steam heat in the winter was all that passed for climate control. An atmosphere of decaying elegance pervaded the building. Grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities were helping to keep YIVO afloat and rejuvenate its scholarly community and its workforce. I came to YIVO as a library intern in January 1976 and was hired as an assistant librarian a few months later, thanks to an NEH grant that underwrote the cataloging of the 5,000 Yiddish books in the Vilna collection. Some of the Yiddish books in the Vilna collection had once been part of the Vilna YIVO's library. And what you see on your screen, this is pages from a digitized copy of A Tog in Regensburg by Joseph Apatoshu. From the stamp in the middle photo, you can see the stamp of the Vilna YIVO library. However, many and possibly most of the Yiddish books in the Vilna collection belong to the Strashun library. It's not always remember that the Strashun library was not, by the 1930s, was not only the library bequeathed to it by the collector Matisyahu Strashun, but it was a library of the Kehila, the religious community of Vilna, and it included books from many, many sources. Cataloging these Yiddish books exposed me day in, day out to a substantial cross-section of the printed legacy in that language. Among the newly published Yiddish books that the library was acquiring were suspense-filled tales about Hasidic rebbes, textbooks for beginners, picture books, and a rudimentary Yiddish dictionary for classroom use in religious schools. This was my introduction to the emerging genre of Yiddish publications aimed at Haredi readers of all ages. Cataloging of the Vilna Yiddish collection was supervised by Bella Haas-Weinberg. If Mendel Elkin was the library's premier collection builder and Dina Abramowicz its peerless reference librarian, then Bella was the YIVO Library's first bona fide library scientist. One of Bella's signature projects at YIVO was her extraordinary index to Dr. Shlomo Noble's translation of Max Weinreich's History of the Yiddish Language. An especially important feature of her index is its inclusion of all of the Yiddish lexical items, in other words, words, Yiddish words, that are mentioned within Weinreich's text. That approach was continued by Herschel Paul Glaser in the index to the expanded edition that came out in 2008, which you see on the right side of your screen. Bella also led courses in YIVO, in Judaica and Hebraica cataloging, and starting in 1983, the YIVO Library served as the de facto home base for the professional journal that she co-founded, Judaica Librarianship. When Bella accepted a faculty position in the Division of Library and Information Science at St. John's University, she also stayed on as YIVO's consulting librarian. One of the signal accomplishments of the library during those years, the late 80s and 90s, was the publication of the Yiddish catalog and authority file of the YIVO Library, which Bella and I co-edited. It's a facsimile in 5 volumes. Turn back. You can see those 2 sets of those 5 volumes on the top shelf in the upper left of that photo. A facsimile of the library's Yiddish card catalog, its card catalog of microfilms, and the file of name headings used by the library's catalogers, which is known in library jargon as the authority file. And it also includes introductions by Bella and by yours truly. The Yiddish catalog and authority file of the YIVO Library was published in 1990 by G.K. Hall. While YIVO's librarians were well aware that there should eventually be online access to the library's holdings, we felt strongly that there's invaluable information contained in the legacy card files that for various reasons could not be fully replicated in the online environment. The end of the Cold War led to increasing contacts with libraries and archives in Eastern Europe. YIVO's final years on Fifth Avenue and the years that followed coincided with impactful developments in Central and Eastern Europe. In 1989, even before Lithuania regained its independence, YIVO's executive director Sam Norwich and its chief archivist Marek Webb visited Vilnius in a quest to locate those portions of YIVO's pre-war archives and library that had survived the Nazi occupation and the subsequent decades of Soviet rule. I visited Vilnius twice during the 1990s, where I learned firsthand about the Jewish book, periodical, and newspaper holdings in the Lithuanian National Library. In 1995, a cache of documents which had been part of the Vilna YIVO's archives was shipped from Vilnius to New York through a loan agreement that YIVO reached with Lithuanian authorities. These photos were taken in YIVO's temporary quarters on 57th Street. Ultimately, over the course of 3 decades, YIVO's engagement with library and archival authorities in Vilnius led to the Edward Blank YIVO Vilna online collections, an ambitious digitization project that pools YIVO's archival documents and library books in both New York and Vilnius. The project was officially launched in 2015, and online access to the collections went live in 2022. In February 1992, just weeks after Ukraine became independent, I joined Sam Norwich and Marek Webb on an exploratory trip to Kiev, where we visited the Vernadsky Library, Ukraine's national library. The extent and content of its Judaica holdings were still shrouded in mystery. The Vernadsky Library's administrators and staff cracked open the doors just a bit to show us some of the storage areas where the Jewish book and newspaper collections were housed. The scholarly world soon learned that much of the fabulous Ansky and Beregovsky ethnographic archives is housed at the Vernadsky Library. Some of the Vernadsky's very rare Yiddish newspapers have been digitized, and they remain accessible even today under wartime conditions. I should mention one other international initiative undertaken by the YIVO Library during the 1990s. In November 1994, 4 months after the terrorist bombing of the AMIA Jewish Community Building in Buenos Aires, I traveled there on a fact-finding trip together with Niels Zagorin of the Yiddish Book Center. The Fundación YIVO, the Argentine cousin of the New York YIVO, had been located inside the AMIA building. we sought to assess the damage that had been wrought by the bombing, which cost 85 lives, and to explore how we might help the Fundación YIVO with the recovery efforts that were getting underway. And at the left, you see a photo of some of the books that were salvaged from the ruins of that building. And you might notice the book plate in one of the books for an organization called Jewish Cultural Reconstruction. And I can speak about that at somewhat greater length or in response to any questions you might have during the Q&A. And at the right is a person who was for a long time associated with the YIVO in Buenos Aires, Esther Schwartz. And I took that photo standing inside what remained the ruins of the AMIA building. By the way, and you might hear this later in the announcements, on March 3rd, the two YIVOs, New York and Buenos Aires, together with the Association of Jewish Libraries, will present a joint program, Yiddish in the Americas, celebrating YIVO and YIVO in the Western Hemisphere. Sylvia Hansmann, director of the Buenos Aires YIVO, and Stephanie Halpern, chief archivist of the New York YIVO, in that event, will relate the history of their institutions and talk about ongoing projects. And they'll also present selected items from their collections, and they will commemorate individuals whose work shaped the two institutions and their collections. Whoops. Excuse me. So by the start of the 1990s, YIVO's attentions were increasingly focused on survival strategies. Major grant funding had largely petered out and was only partially replaced by fundraising among private donors and foundations. It wasn't going to be easy for YIVO to chart a path forward on its own. The need for additional space had grown even more acute with the acquisition in 1992 of the Bund collection, whose holdings spanned 720 linear feet of manuscripts, pamphlets, and photographs, plus 20,000 volumes of books and periodicals. And YIVO is now moving forward with plans to digitize the Bund archives. During the 90s, YIVO relocated its entire operations twice, first during the fall of 1994 and the second time in late 1999. The logistics manager for both moves was Stanley Bergman, a librarian who supervised YIVO's preservation and microfilming operations. And what you see on these photos are photos that I took during the move in the autumn of 1994, including photos taken in the third floor book stacks, the stacks that I mentioned where Mendel Elkin once kept his office. And you see there are very high ceilings, and if you count the number of shelves from floor to ceiling, it's 11 or 12 shelves per unit, which frankly is quite scary when you have to climb up on a ladder and retrieve something from those shelves. I will also add that the aisle width between the rows of shelves was less than what we would is prescribed, at least today, in codes for library shelving, at least in New York. So we had to move a lot of stuff from rather confined from a rather confined setting up there. The Fifth Avenue mansion was sold to backers of the Neue Gallery. Under the leadership of YIVO's board chair, Bruce Slovan, YIVO began to explore the partnerships that eventually led to the formation of the Center for Jewish History. In that connection, I'd like to share a recurring nightmare that I've had. In it, the Neue Galerie has for some reason vacated its premises, and I've been charged with the responsibility of returning the YIVO Library's collections to the former Vanderbilt property. During the 39 years that YIVO was located at 1048 Fifth Avenue, the library's collections, as you've seen, were densely packed across 6 of the building's 7 stories, from its steamy sub-basement to a row of closets on the 5th floor. I would not want to have to move the collections back into that building, in other words. So in 1994, YIVO moved from Fifth Avenue into temporary quarters in an office building on West 57th Street, overlooking the Hudson River. The building's ground floor was a showroom for the Ford Motor Company. The TV journalist Geraldo Rivera had his office down the hall from YIVO's rented premises on the 11th floor, and the CBS 60 Minutes crew often shared the same elevator with YIVO's staff. For the first time, the library and archives shared a rather cozy reading room. There was space in the office building, only for a modest segment of the book collection and of the archives as well. Researchers from all over continued to visit YIVO in that rather corporate setting. In those years, the library was taking its first modest steps toward bringing its catalog online. In 1999, YIVO moved to what is now the Center for Jewish History, where it settled into its unique partnership with the other organizations that are located there. A common reading room serves researchers who consult materials from the libraries and archives of 3 of the center's partners. Items from their collections are listed in the center's shared catalog. Portions of the library and archival holdings are increasingly being digitized. The Ackman and Ziff Family Genealogy Institute occupies a small space next to the reading room. Remember, I mentioned the horde of genealogists who began to show up at YIVO in the late 1970s. I think they've continued to show up. Meanwhile, the center's partners, including YIVO, retain their institutional independence. Efforts to bring the YIVO Library's catalog online accelerated after 2000, when YIVO, the American Jewish Historical Society, and the Leo Baeck Institute joined hands to create the center's integrated library and archival catalog. The YIVO Library has just launched a special project to inventory and catalog its oversized periodicals collection. Looking ahead, I hope that the library will build upon its impressive accomplishments on the digitization front. For example, there's the Universal Yiddish Library, involving a proposed partnership between YIVO, the Yiddish Book Center, New York Public Library, and the National Library of Israel. Its main goal is to build out the corpus of digitized Yiddish books held by these 4 institutions. Another digitization venture that the YIVO Library might consider joining, this is only a suggestion on my part, is the Historical Jewish Press, or J-Press, which has made so many Jewish newspapers and magazines accessible online. J-Press is administered by the National Library of Israel and by Tel Aviv University, and it's enlisted the collaboration of numerous libraries outside of Israel, including other research libraries in New York City. A library's collections and services are dynamic, not static. Through its extraordinary collections, the YIVO Library serves as a critical node in the landscape of Jewish studies research, one with a global reach. But historically, as we've seen, another hallmark of the YIVO Library has been its librarians' engagement with their public. A skilled and expert library staff is essential to YIVO's scholarly enterprise in all its dimensions. This is no less true in the 21st century than it was in the era of Mendel Elkin and Dina Abramowicz. And with that, I thank you, and I stop my screen share.
Zachary, thank you so much. Excuse me. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. We've got a bunch of questions in the Q&A. I just want to remind everyone in the audience that now is the time to put your questions into the Q&A function so that we can ask them. We've got about 15 minutes here. Zachary, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about your tenure at YIVO. You very humbly, mentioned yourself in passing, but can you just tell us, what was the span of your time at YIVO, and how did your role develop during that time?
So I was, as I mentioned, I was hired first in 1976. Well, the prelude to being hired. So in the fall of 1975, I was a student in the library school at the University of Minnesota. You might be able to tell from my accent that I come from the Midwest. Oh no, as we say in Minnesota. And I had been a student in the Oriel Weinreich Summer Yiddish program a few years earlier. So I was on YIVO's mailing list, and I got a brochure from the Max Weinreich Center listing its courses and other programs. And one of them was an internship in Judaica librarianship. And so I wrote a letter to Dina Abramowicz saying, well, I'm finishing library school and I know Yiddish. So what are the options if I pull up stakes and move to New York? Will there be a job for me? And I got a reply not from Dina, but from Bella Haas-Weinberg. And she said, well, come for the internship, and we've gotten a grant to catalog these Yiddish books in the Vilna collection. So I came to New York, and for a few months, I was in the internship, and I also was a microfilm camera operator in the basement of that building, and under the supervision of a notorious figure in YIVO's archival history, Zosa Tchaikovsky. And I was microfilming documents from the Eliyahu Cherikover archives. And then in June of 1976, I became a librarian, cataloging the Yiddish books, along with, there was one other librarian assigned to that project. And but as I mentioned, and I worked on that project till 81 when I moved away for a few years to the Jewish Public Library in Montreal. So I mentioned the hordes of genealogists. They started to show up on our doorstep around late 1977 after Roots came out. And Dina was a little, she assigned me to attend a gathering of Jewish genealogists, the beginnings of the Jewish Genealogical Society of New York in late 1977. And I came back and reported to her on that. And she said, basically, you're hired as our genealogical reference librarian. And as I like to say, I'm not the one who coined this, obviously, those that can do, those who can't teach. I was one of those who can't. I have never really worked seriously on my own genealogy. So that was another facet of my assignment at YIVO. After working for 6 years at the Jewish Public Library, I was hired back at YIVO as head librarian, and I worked at YIVO from 87 to 99 in that capacity. And as it was an interesting time, and there's a lot one could say about that period, but for me, the lasting memory is having to participate in, or being privileged to participate in 2 collection moves. And that's enough, almost, I would say, to burn out any librarian. So I then took a health cure and came to Stanford University in the fall of 1999.
And you're still having nightmares about it, it sounds like.
I have dreams and nightmares. I've lately had some nightmares about Stanford, but I shouldn't go into those. That's not relevant to this presentation.
We've received a lot of very kind remarks, just with appreciation for the wonderful presentation. Just want to share that, and also a greeting from a Mark Friedman from the Weinreich Center of the 70s. While we're on that era, and some people are asking about some of the amazing personalities that you encountered during your time at YIVO. Do you have any stories to share about some of these storied individuals, Dina Abramowicz, Zosha Tchaikovsky, and others?
I'll save the Tchaikovsky stories for offline, except for maybe one slightly G-rated reminiscence. So in the Fifth Avenue building, there was an old-fashioned switchboard right by the door, and it was the switchboard operator in those years was Faggy Letterman. I'm talking about the second half of the 1970s. And Faggy, those who remember her know that she was a from Mendel from Williamsburg. And there was a table, I think it was round, facing in the foyer, facing the reception desk, where staff members would sometimes sit and eat their lunch. And Tchaikovsky was notorious for his love of ham sandwiches. And Faggy, I remember her turning to him once and saying, "Are you eating one of those Chazer sandwiches, Tchaikovsky?" But about him, I'd have to go offline to elaborate. And well, Dina, she, okay, it's hard to come up with specific memories as opposed to the ambiance, but she was a figure of really interest. She was a representative, I would say, an heir to the Vilna Lithuanian Haskalah, the Russian-speaking Haskalah. And once the former diplomat George Kennan came to YIVO, had an appointment with her, and he was working on a book, and there was a figure that he was researching who was a Russian Jewish convert to Christianity, but who figured in the diplomatic history of Tsarist Russia. And he spent, I would say, an hour speaking to Dina, not only, of course, about that, his research interest, but sort of gleaning from her just by osmosis what she culturally represented. And I should add that Kennan, as a young diplomat in the 1920s, studied Russian in Riga, so he had some familiarity with the Baltics as well as with Russia proper. That's just kind of an offhand thing, but I could. The other thing I'll remember is whenever I saw her having to count anything, calculate something with numbers, I had come to YIVO thinking this was the great Yiddish librarian, and of course that's what she was, but she was always counting in Russian, and that came as a surprise to me.
There's a lot of different questions about the discovery of the materials in Vilnius after when that started happening in late 80s, early 90s. I wonder if you have any other reflections on that. Some people are talking about the sadness of seeing material there, and obviously a lot has been done with it both there and here. And there's also questions about the material that came to YIVO. It was borrowed by YIVO in the mid 90s. What exactly had to happen to that material? Could you just offer some comments on all of these questions?
I'll try. So the person who had, or the individuals who in that late 80s phase of this encounter had the closest engagement with authorities in Vilnius were Sam Norwich and the late Marek Webb. And I think Sam could speak more to the point of those early encounters in Vilnius. First of all, remember just how much was shrouded not only in mystery, how much we really did not know about the entire state of libraries and archives, Jewish collections in the former Soviet republics until the late 1980s. The doors were slammed shut. And so hints were coming out, and Sam and Marek traveled there in '89. And their travels there were even the subject of a Purim parody, the Manias von YIVO, which in that longer slideshow, I included a page from it, but I decided we don't need to really go there. It involved a move of YIVO in its entirety back to Vilna. So one of the parody articles. Anyway, Sam could speak more to the point, but the fact of the survival, in fact, of these collections belonging to YIVO in Vilna, I think that probably came as I would call it as a pleasant surprise. They hadn't been destroyed. They hadn't been buried. They'd been Lithuanian library figures had shielded them from the attentions of maybe a more predatory political regime. And how these negotiations proceeded over the late 80s and 90s. Again, I was not directly involved in them. My first trip there was in '93 with Alan Nadler. And that was really just part of the ongoing effort to find out more about not only the YIVO collection, but Jewish collections in general, and the archives and the former book chamber of the Lithuanian National Library. And Alan was involved, I think, more directly in negotiations along with Bruce Slovan to get those documents that came to YIVO in '95. And again, this was not a YIVO, that particular operation was not a YIVO library project, but when those documents came, the intention was to organize and microfilm them. I think by the time I left YIVO in 1999, they were still at YIVO. They had been arranged, but I believe, and others can speak to this more directly, that the originals were sent back to Vilnius and are part of the Edward Blank project, the digitization project.
We have a few other questions about the variety of different libraries today that cover a similar area as YIVO's library, like the Yiddish Book Center, and then also questions about just supposing there must be libraries in South America, South Africa that have cover some similar ground. Can you just offer some reflections on the landscape of such libraries and how YIVO stands out amongst the group?
Well, to begin with, YIVO's library is a research library, and the Yiddish Book Center has carved out its own very distinctive profile, initially as a collecting agency for orphaned or about to be orphaned Yiddish books. And it has morphed or evolved, I should say, into an organization that has an educational program really geared at a general public, and a translation program, and most recently, as you've doubtless heard, they have opened an ambitious permanent exhibition, which I haven't seen. I only saw, I visited there a few months before it opened. But I would say the Yiddish Book Center's activities complement those of YIVO rather than duplicate or compete. And one of the reasons this Universal Yiddish Library concept was launched was precisely because the Yiddish Book Center has gaps in its holdings of what it has digitized. It has digitized basically what it has collected, mainly from American, but also from South American and other sources. And there are gaps in its coverage, which YIVO, the National Library of Israel, New York Public, can also help to fill in. South America. So most of the library of the Buenos Aires YIVO, most of its collections were fortunately located in the portion of the building that was not blown up or not completely blown up by that bombing in 1994. And they were recovered, but it's taken a long time for them to reconstitute what they had. And this is true also of their archives. Now, the archives in the Buenos Aires YIVO focus primarily on South America and on Argentina, whereas YIVO in New York is carrying on the legacy in a broader sense, I think, than of the legacy of the Vilna YIVO, and of course, including collections relating to the United States. Of course, there are Judaica and Hebraica libraries in many other institutions, universities in Europe and the United States, Canada. I worked at one, the Jewish Public Library. I can talk about that offline as well, each with its own distinctive character. But where YIVO, I'd say, stands out is as an Yiddish-facing, though not exclusively Yiddishist, institution that is devoted to a research or a mission. I hope that wasn't too long-winded.
Oh, that was great. We have just time for one last question. And this is a good one to end on, I think. Could you name a few items in the library that you think are standout items, if someone's visiting and they wanted to check them out, what what comes to mind?
Um, well, let me, so one of the first uh, one of the first things that I became familiar with when I was working as a cataloger of Yiddish books back in the late 70s were the illustrated Yiddish books, especially children's books, published in the period of revolutionary Russia, late teens, early 20s, and including especially books, and the names of them they'll come to me later, but for example, the Ingold Single Chvat by Mani Leib, illustrated by Lisitsky, also the Chad Gadya, illustrated by Lisitsky. And I became somewhat familiar with artists like Yosef Chaikov. Of course, Chagall illustrated some of these books. Magazines published in mid-20s Berlin, like Milgräum illustrated Yiddish, fine art magazine really is so that's one aspect. Now, on a very utterly different level, so I mentioned in my talk the Nazi collection. And when I had nothing better to do, sometimes I would wander the stacks on Fifth Avenue stacks, and I would look at some of the publications in the Nazi collection. And there were publication, I mean, right up until like 2 or 3 months before Germany's surrender in May of 1945, they were publishing so-called or quasi-scholarly magazine or journals that were of such a repulsive anti-Semitic nature, and that I don't know how widely held these journals are in any library. I think that's one reason why one of my successors, Aviva Ostrinsky, was involved in the microfilming of that collection. So, and finally, of course, the also relating to Holocaust collections, the Displaced Persons Press. It's an amazing, amazing resource, and it's one that I would love to see digitized if plans have not already been made for that to happen. Oh, and finally, of course, as anyone who knows Eddie Portnoy would want to see, as I know him, Der Größer Kundis, the Yiddish humor magazine, digitized. The Historical Jewish Press has digitized Der Kibitzer, but it has not, as far as I know, gotten around to Der Größer Kundis, and that would be a real win for YIVO.
Well, Zachary, on that note, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And it's been a pleasure for me too.